host.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm doing two things at once here, Roxanne. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna make Roxanne host and then we'll get started here. There.
Good. All right.
Yeah, I should be good now. Sorry, I'm a little fumbly here.
Awesome. All right.
Okay. So
welcome everyone.
Yes, welcome and thank you for having us and thank you for being here. This is wonderful. My name is Michelle Vissel. I'm the education coordinator for Voice of Albertans with Disabilities. I've been with them for about just over 4 years now, and I was on the board before that. So this is kind of my passion, my life's work. I absolutely love doing these presentations. And I'll introduce Roxanne, my co-presenter, who has been with me for about 4 years too.
Yes, we were co-conspirators to get this program started. Yeah, thanks everyone. And yeah, I'm a disability advocate in the community. I retired from actual work in 2005 and decided that day that this is what I would use my pension for, is to advocate for rights of people with disabilities. And it's a long, hard road and I don't feel like I make enough change, but keep trying.
We're making progress.
So. Yeah, and this is one way we do that. So yeah, thanks for coming today.
Yes, and before we actually dive in, I'm just going to read a short little land acknowledgement here. We like to acknowledge that Edmonton, where we live and work, is on traditional Treaty 6 territory. And we also like to acknowledge the Métis people of Alberta who share a very deep connection with this land. So having said that, so this is our ableism, the basics. And Roxanne and I feel, and my presentation team feel that this type of education is so important for everybody, no matter what your age or profession. Okay. So who we are. Voice of Albertans with Disability is a nonprofit organization, and we're across disability, and we're across Alberta. So we help and do presentations across Alberta, and it doesn't matter what type of disability that person has. So, yeah.
And what we do, we give disability awareness presentations like this one in schools, from junior high to high school, as well as universities, colleges, as well as some businesses and organizations. We'd love to see a little more business, but we do when we're asked.
Yeah. And support and referral. So what that is we have a lady in our office that specializes on doing H forms, CPP forms, H appeal forms, and also we do taxes during tax season, and all these services are done for free. So if you know anyone that needs an H form filled out, just give us a call. It's completely free.
Appointment based now with COVID.
Yeah, yeah, it's always been appointment based, but yeah.
Yeah, and then the last one is accessibility assessments. So we have a lovely young woman in the office who's very passionate about accessibility. Yeah, and she'll come out and not only survey the physical accessibility, but she'll look at policies and procedures and other things that relate to people with disabilities. So it's a great program.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we like to give you this quote. It was actually originally by Nelson Mandela, but we have just modified it to a first-person perspective for ourselves. And it says, "We do not need the patronage of the non-disabled. It is not for us to adapt to the dominant and dominating world of the so-called non-disabled. It is for them to adapt their understanding of a common humanity, to learn of the richness of how human life is diverse, and to recognize the presence of disability in our human midst as an enrichment of our diversity. So that's just where we like to start.
Okay.
And so we've just created this. We've only used it a few times, but it's a privilege backpack. And this is just a way of assessing what privilege you carry in the world. And this is not like inclusive of everyone, but we just like it as a little exercise just to recognize.
Yeah. So if you answer, what is it? No to these questions, put them on.
No.
Go ahead.
If you answer yes, you can just make a little check, piece of paper, check it off, and then that's in your backpack. And basically what happens at the end is if your backpack is full, then you have a lot of privilege and should sit back and listen as opposed to lead. So the conversation, I guess. Okay,
so
Michelle.
The first question, it's been a while, sorry. Can you reach the top of your fridge? So if you answer yes, you put a little check or put it in your knapsack.
And second is, are you in charge of planning your day? So if you answer yes, then that's privilege and it goes in your backpack.
And the third one, can you cross the street safely? So again, if it's yes, you put it in your knapsack. It's a privilege.
Me, it depends on the season.
Yeah, me too. Rox and I have done this.
And the next one is, do you understand every word a retail clerk says to you? So if you answer yes, it's in the backpack.
If the elevator is out of order, can you take the stairs? And if you answer yes, put it in your backpack.
And number 6, when it snows, are you able to get to work if the sidewalks aren't clear?
And the last one on this slide is, are you able to have a verbal conversation on the phone?
Okay, and then we have 3 more that if you answer no, you put a check or you put something in your backpack. So the first one is, have you been asked if your spouse has a disability?
Oh.
If you say no, then you put a check in your backpack.
And have you ever been asked if you were born this way? If you answer no, put it in your backpack.
And the last one, have you ever been asked to just behave or move normally? So again, if it's no, it goes in your backpack. And so we don't want to know your answers. No. This is just for your own awareness. Michelle and I score about a 4 and a 5 out of this workshop. And we are very aware that we have privilege in the disability community. And that's part of why we do this work, is we're trying to use that privilege for everyone. Okay. So now we move on to the World Health's definition of disability. Up until a few years ago, we would even say that Canada didn't have a disability, but in 2019, they passed the Accessible Canada Act, which does give us a definition, but we still like the World Health Organization's better. It's more extensive. So disabilities is an umbrella term covering impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. And I'll use myself as an example. So an impairment is a problem in body function or structure. So for myself, simply, my legs don't work. I use a wheelchair. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual executing a task or an action. So that would be myself encountering a set of stairs. Definitely becomes, especially if they have to go up. Sometimes if I'm able to go down. So while a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. So it's whatever's at the top of those stairs. It could be a job interview. It could be a family reunion. or it could be a party with, in college with friends. I remember specifically one of those when I was in my 20s.
So the second part of the definition is disability is thus not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomena reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of society in which he or she lives. Overcoming the difficulties faced by people with disabilities requires interventions to remove environmental and social barriers. So what this is saying is it's just not the person, it's the environment and the society in which they live as well that put up the barriers.
And so just to cover some of the scope, disability covers many conditions, some visible, some not visible. A disability may have been present from birth, caused by an accident, or developed over time. There are physical, mental, and learning disabilities, mental disorders, hearing or vision disabilities, epilepsy, drug and alcohol dependencies, environmental sensitivities, and other conditions. So as you can see, the scope of disability is quite broad. And we just like to make a couple of comments about some of the laws in Canada that affect disability. And so the big one for me, I was really excited about in 2010 was that we ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And so what that normally means is when you ratify a convention is you are saying to the world, I'm on board, we're in it, we're doing it. Which was not the case. This was barely announced in the meet. Like I happened to find this out by chance, not because it was a big deal in Canada. It was barely recognized that it even happened. And then unfortunately, a statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities wrote a letter to Canada in April of 2019, basically giving us a failing grade, saying that we lag behind other developed countries significantly. That was really bittersweet for me. I kind of knew that because I felt like I've been screaming from the rooftops since I started advocacy. But sometimes you kind of wish that maybe it was getting better, and just because you're so focused on, the rights that you don't notice. But so this was really bittersweet when we found this out, because we'd like Canada to do better. We really would. And so interestingly enough, a few months later, we did pass the Accessible Canada Act. But unfortunately, the Accessible Canada Act has very limited power and scope. It only affects federally mandated businesses, which are like banks and airports and bus terminals, right? But it doesn't affect the grocery store. It doesn't affect our medical system here in Alberta, right? It has no effect over that. So again, kind of bittersweet, but a step in the right direction. And what should happen next is every province should then adopt and its own set of legislation. And so we got our fingers crossed. We've heard little rumblings that maybe somebody's talking about that in Alberta. Okay.
Okay. Some statistics, and these are the latest stats that we can find is 2017. So a survey in 2017, 22% of Canadians identify as having a disability. So that means 1 in 5 people, 22% of the Canadian population aged 15 years and over identify with having a disability. So that's about 6.2 million Canadians that identify with having a disability. And keep in mind, these stats do not include the people that don't identify with having a disability. And they also don't include the people that, the one person that has a disability or identifies with having a disability. It doesn't include all the people that one person affects in their lives, like the parents, siblings, cousins, friends. It does not include those people either. Excuse me. Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
so Michelle and I believe that disability has a much greater effect than we even realize in families and around the country.
So, and this is just a slide for everyone to give you guys something to think about. So, disability does not discriminate. Disability exists in every demographic. So, male, female, young, old, Muslim, Catholic, etc. If we improve the lives of people with disability, then we may improve the lives of people in every other demographic, because disability covers every demographic.
Yeah, Michelle and I think that we should just spend a little time here and see what happens, but doesn't seem to be the way it always works.
No.
So one thing we really like to talk about are activities of daily living and how important it is that activities of daily living are supported for people with disabilities, because if they are supported, then they can move on to do bigger and better things in their lives, like get educated, employed, get married, have kids, do all the things that their friends and families are doing. But we don't provide great support for people in their activities of daily living. For myself, I always just needed a little bit of help, like washing the floors and changing the sheets on my bed, some of these bigger tasks in my house that I just couldn't do. And so I'm always negotiating with friends and family and roommates, and it's always messy. And I never quite had enough income to just afford that on my own. But that little bit would have made the difference. I might still be working today, but living in a home that isn't clean was not good for my mental health. Right. And so, it's important that we connect all these factors in order to make people as independent and in their lives as possible.
And spoon theory. So spoon theory is the premise of spoon theory is that everybody wakes up with 10 spoons, and the spoons are our energy for the day. So me as an example, I wake up with 10 spoons. By the time I get up and make the bed, and keep in mind, I have a king size bed, so it's a lot of walking around. Wash up, do my hair, do my makeup, and get my stuff ready to go. I'm down 2 spoons. And that's even before I've walked out the door. Then I have to spend time waiting for my ride and then transfer to the seat and back again once I'm at my destination at work. So by the time that's all done, I'm down 1 more spoon. I have 7 spoons left. So I worked the whole day. So I have used another 5 spoons, about 5 spoons at work. When I get home, I have 2 spoons left, just enough to get changed, just enough energy to change, wash up, and eat supper. Quite often, I don't have enough energy to log into a Zoom meeting or call family and friends or friends. Also, sometimes we have to give up something in order to do something that we want to later because of our energy levels. So, very simple example. So I give up making the bed in the morning just so I have enough energy at the end of the day to log in to a Zoom meeting or call my mom. Anything you want to add, Roxy?
No, good job, Michelle.
Okay.
Yeah, spoon theory.
Yes, spoon theory. Okay, this is one of my favorite cartoons. To me, it says it all. A little girl is using a wheelchair, and two other little girls walk up to her and ask her, "Do we call you handicapped, or do we call you disabled?" And she looks at them and she goes, "Call me Charlotte." Simple answer. Ideally, you want to call people by their name. And to me, that says it all right there.
So we have some tips we like to give you, some of the, the basics of, disability awareness and ableism. So the first one, we just get asked this a lot, like, is it okay to offer help? Well, Michelle and I strongly believe that it is always okay to offer help. We are Canadians, we're Albertans, we're friendly, helpful people, absolutely. But there's a couple of qualifiers. So first of all, the person should appear to be struggling. It wouldn't go over well if you sort of randomly offered people with disabilities help in the community. That might not go over well. So you'd want them to be struggling. And so if you offer them help, and if they say yes, you say, well, then how can I help you? Because we, if we're out on the streets on our own, believe me, we know how to do things. I would tell you where to stand, what hand to use, so that we, if I fell out of my chair, right? And I would have all the instructions to help you so that nobody gets hurt. So it's always important to ask how. But secondly, if you're told no, move on. Just you've done your good deed for the day, move on. Well, we get a lot of pushback on that, and I had one university student say to me one year, but what if I came across a guy and he was in a snowbank and he was shivering? I'm like, well, did you ask him if he needed help? And he said, well, yeah. And he said, no. And I'm like, well, then move on. Well, I can't leave him there. And I'm thinking, well, people with disabilities get to be as stupid and foolhardy as everybody else. It's our right as a Canadian citizen, but through a bit of conversation, we all agreed that maybe he should call 911, because something not everybody realizes, especially those of us that use mobility devices, is we may only use half of our bodies, but the half we use is incredibly strong. You would end up in that snowbank rolling around with that guy. So call 911.
Okay, the next one is person first language. So exactly like the cartoon we just showed you. And we say people with disabilities as opposed to disabled people. And one point I want to make too is this is your best options at first is person first language, but it's also personal choice. Some people do not like person first language, and that's fine. And the UK, it really doesn't exist, person first language. They don't use it. So it is personal choice, but it's good to start off with person first language. And just like the cartoon, ideally, you just want to call the person by their name.
Well, and the reason the UK refuses to use person first language is they've decided that disability is a societal issue. It is not attached to a person. So it's not a person with a disability, it's a disabled person because they are disabled in the society in which they live. So there's some theory around it.
Yeah, there is.
And then the power of language. We think this is really, really important. So for myself, I had to learn just kind of when I started doing this advocacy work, I used to say, I'm in a wheelchair, but I'm not in a wheelchair. I use a wheelchair. The wheelchair has no power. When you say I'm in a wheelchair, it sounds like somehow the wheelchair is going to do something, and it's not. It's only going to move if I make it move. And so you notice that there's more power in that. And so what the rule we like to use is do not use words that imply a feeling around a disability, right? So people will often say confined to a wheelchair. Well, this wheelchair gave me the most freedom I have ever had. It was life-changing for me. I could walk to this, it's from in high school. I could then go to the 7-Eleven with my friends and have Diet Coke and corn nuts, or I couldn't do that walking on crutches and braces. So it's important to not use that. Some people say wheelchair bound. I'm not, again, there's nothing attaching me to this thing. I don't even have a seatbelt because I think that's dangerous to be attached to a piece of metal that's going to, no.
Yeah.
But again, personal choice, always personal choice. But other words that we use is like people say afflicted with blindness. Well, no, the people are just blind. The words like profoundly deaf, not appropriate in regular society. They're just deaf. Profoundly deaf is a medical term, but it's not used in everyday language. So it's really just, and those are all about kind of attaching a feeling to it. So that's kind of the rule that we like to use. Did I miss anything, Michelle?
No,
Okay.
you did perfect.
All right.
Okay, the next one is a big one. Don't make assumptions. And we're all human and we all do, but try not to. One of the most common assumptions or questions people ask or make about me is when people find out that I'm married, they automatically ask, is your husband disabled too? And I'll say no. And then I'll say, no, am I doing something wrong? Is there some rule that I'm supposed to marry another disabled person? There's no rule saying that people with disabilities have to hang out or marry other people with disabilities. There's no rule at all. And here's a little story. I was doing a presentation like this for a school, and I got there early. So the teacher and I went into the staff room to have coffee and chit chat. And she asked me, are you married? And I said, yes. And she automatically, without skipping a beat, she goes, is your husband disabled as well? And I said, no. And she looked at me and she goes, I'm shocked. And I look at her and I go, I'm shocked, you're shocked. Like, but yeah, that's one of the biggest assumptions or misconceptions people make when they find out that I'm married. But I know I just said don't make assumptions, but there's one assumption we would like you to make, and Roxanne's going to explain that one.
Yeah, we think it would be helpful if you assumed, or if we all assumed, that people have complete agency until they tell you differently or prove to you differently. So you treat everybody like they are completely capable and fully in control until they tell you differently or show you, but everyone deserves that opportunity. And quite often people's assumptions hold them back, when if somebody had just given them a chance, they would have proved themselves or shown you what they were able to do. But when you put an assumption on top of them, it makes it harder. So yeah. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Okay, so these are some words that Michelle and I don't like. There's no rules about it. We're just telling you, as people, we figured out this year, Michelle and I have 100 years of disability experience between the two of us.
Yeah.
So this is based on all that lived experience. So the first one is handicapped. And we just think it's an outdated term. We don't like it. It's used for golf, it's still very much used. You still see it on signs, but there's a little story that we like to tell that maybe helps people realize why we don't like it. And there's a story about its origins being that in medieval times, the king sent his people out to war. And of course, they come back disabled, right? War veterans. And in his great wisdom, he decided that at the time it was illegal to beg on the streets. So he decreed that war veterans, disabled war veterans, could beg on the streets. That was their reward for going to war for him, that they could beg. And so that's how we find it, is that there's a connotation of charity. And it's really bad in Canada. Our needs are not charitable. Our needs should not be looked at by charities. That should be things happening through our system. So yeah, anyways, that's what we think about handicapped.
And the next one is special needs. First, I'm going to tell you how this word came about as well. The phrase came about as an attempt to be less negative, labeling disabled children's educational needs rather than their condition. And you hear the phrase special needs a lot in schools. And I was one of those kids, and I hated being labeled that. I got called out a lot more. Oh, you're one of those kids. So I grew up not liking that label at all. And the term special needs, so children labeled with that term can't grow up with dignity when they're labeled with that. If children were called children with disabilities or students with disabilities, then they can grow up with dignity into adults with disabilities. Yeah. Anything you want to add to that one, Max?
Just that again, it's implying a feeling, right? We don't think our needs are special. They're ours. They're what we need. And trying to make it nice is ridiculous. Life is hard for people with disabilities, period. And trying to make it all nice for the kids when we know, Michelle and I were kids with disabilities. We know we have a disability.
Yeah.
You can't put a nice word on it to make it all better, right? So that's just, we don't think that's the way to tackle it. And in fact, we've avoided some of the societal issues by trying to make it nice when it's not nice. It's a hard life. And we need to be real. And like Michelle said, people with disabilities is a legal term that we can use to assert ourselves in the world, right? Not special needs. Special needs is not defined in law. People with disabilities is. So yeah, that's kind of what we think about that. And so the next one is inspiration porn. And there is a great TED Talk by a lovely lady named Stella. You can just Google it, inspiration porn on TED Talks. But Michelle has a very, very similar story. So we'll just let her tell you.
Yeah. And my story, I didn't realize was into inspirational porn until we started doing the slide. So in high school, I was in grade 12, and at the end of the year, awards get handed out. And I ended up getting an award called the Caritas Christi Award. And because I went to the Catholic school, the Caritas Christi Award was giving of yourself, being compassionate, that kind of thing, right? And like when I first got the award, I mean, I was honored, I was thrilled. I've never won an award in school before, kind of thing. And afterwards, though, I got thinking, why did I get this? Because I wasn't a part of the peer support group or any groups except the yearbook group. But I focused on school. Yes, I talked to a lot of the kids in school and stuff, but I couldn't figure out why I got this award. And about 5 years later, I asked my mom about it. Did I actually deserve this, or did they just give it to me just because? And the way my mom did not answer told me everything. And that award came off my wall and it came off my resume. I don't even know where it is right now. Yeah. So in other words, sure, we want to be awarded and recognized, but for something we've done well, for something we've done like everybody else, not just because,
Yeah,
you know.
something we deserve.
Yeah.
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 Okay. You got the next one too, Michelle.
I do. That's right. Excuse me. Disability versus unhealthy. So just because a disability or a person has a disability does not mean they're unhealthy. And my own family has shown me this. Actually, I'm the only one out of the three of us girls that has a disability. And now I'm hearing my older and younger sister, they've got all kinds of illnesses and immune deficiencies and need surgeries for this and that. And I'm going, holy crap, I'm pretty healthy compared to them. You know, I haven't had a cold, in 3 or 4 years. So, just because someone does have a disability doesn't mean they're unhealthy. And quite often people associate the two together,
Yeah.
and it's just not true.
Yeah. We don't like those two. I mean, you can have a disability and be unhealthy. It's just not an assumption that should be made. And the last one is medical diagnosis versus functional description. And you may have even noticed today, Michelle and I don't tell you kind of what kind of disability we have, but what we do mention is that we've used a scooter and I use a wheelchair. Those are functional descriptions that are important for people to know. But knowing my medical diagnosis is usually irrelevant to most people. And kind of feels a little invasive, because just because you know a medical term really doesn't give you an idea. I mean, there's a huge scope in those medical terms. So just because you say you have this, it doesn't really tell anyone really where you're at. Where a functional description, that's important to know. Right. It's important that if somebody invites me over to their house, they kind of need to know I use a wheelchair. And so we just think it's important to really think about that and to use functional descriptions as opposed to medical diagnosis, and really not asking people for their medical diagnosis unless you're in a medical situation.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Okay. The next slide is our dignity slide. It's one of the most important slides, I think, anyway. I'm just going to read one of the definitions out. Dignity is the right of a person to be valued and respected for their own sake. So not for their gender, not for their race, for who they are. Not, disability or not, you deserve to be respected for who you are.
Yeah, we all do, for sure.
Yeah.
And so then we just have a couple of examples, and I'm going to tackle the first two: intention versus impact. And so just for a simple example, when I'm out on the streets, almost guaranteed somebody's going to say to me, hey, you should put a motor on that thing, right? And I know their intention. I know they're trying to be funny, trying to start a conversation, but still in my mind, I'm thinking, don't I look able enough? Like, I mean, if I start using a power chair, I'm going to lose my arms. Like, so it's always a weird little thing. No, I never react negatively. I go with the joke. I go with the friendly, but I think it's important for people to think about what impact their words might be having on others. So not only is it important to have the right intention, but it's also important to realize what impact you're having. Because even though your intention might be good, that may not be the way it lands on another person. And that's just as important. If we're going to get by, all of us together in a society, we got to look at both sides. So yeah, and that helps with people to have dignity.
Yeah. And the last one here is risk. And again, I'll use my own example. So there is dignity in taking risks. There is an assumption that we have to protect our children with disabilities. To a certain degree, yes, we do. We have to protect our kids no matter what. But we have to let them take risks. So they have to look, so they can learn critical thinking skills and their own limitations, and just like everyone else. So Roxanne and I were really lucky. We had parents that did let us take risk. For example, my sport in school was horseback riding. Everybody had a hockey, soccer, or whatever. I had a horseback riding. So my mom did not like to drive me to my lessons. She didn't like to watch because she knew if she had to drive me, she had to watch, and it scared her. Me, tiny little Michelle, back then I was tiny, up on this huge horse in total control of the horse, it freaked her out. And even after a couple of really bad accidents, my mom never did say no because she knew it was good for me, not only physically, but it helped me gain confidence and to know myself and to make good decisions, because I had to make good decisions on the horse. Otherwise, I would be on the ground more times than not. So, and this is no different with my sisters too. My parents never told us no, we couldn't try this or do this, because they knew taking risk help us grow. It just, and everyone needs that no matter what.
Yeah, and I have a little story about wheelchair skills. I was teaching
Right.
wheelchair skills at the Glen Rose Hospital one year, and there was this little boy who was about 8 years old, and I thought, oh, I got, so I go up to him and I can see he's pretty good, like he's got some wheelchair skills, right? So I say, well, we got to teach you how to do wheelies, and he started to cry. And I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? These little boys, they follow me in stores. They love my wheels, so I'm thinking, what is going on? I don't understand. um, and after a bit of a conversation, I realized it's because mom told him, no, this was not safe. You can't do this. Well, again, our lives are not safe. And if you want to be independent, you need to know how to do a wheelie, right? If you want to be an independent wheelchair user, it's a necessary skill. And so fortunately, in conversation with mom and little boy and older brother, we decided that older brother would stand behind him and make sure, if he flipped himself over, he wouldn't hit his head. But again, we take risks every day. You cannot, our children with disabilities are no different than any other children, and they need to be able to take those risks. And yet they might hurt themselves. But, and again, this is just somebody who's lived with disability. I think, well, we're already disabled. How much worse could it get? Let the kid play. But again, I'm just being a little, trying to be funny, but risk is really important. Michelle and I strongly believe that that's why we're independent and living on our own today.
Yeah.
Is because our parents actually allowed us, to dream and to believe that we could. And so this is based on psychosocial perspective, 3 types of disability. And I will just say that I didn't read this in a book. This is, again, just my lived experience, in that there's 3 types of disabilities in society right now. And so the first is developmental, which to me is anyone who grew up with their disability. And people who with developmental disabilities are conditioned to believe that somebody knows their bodies better than they do. As children, as a child, I had a team of doctors who told me what I could do, what I couldn't do, or I shouldn't do that, and it really affected the way I saw the world. And it made it so that we think we have to get permission from authorities in order to live our lives, right? Because there were so many of them as children. And so, I know, and Michelle and I both, like, it's a struggle to transition to adulthood and realize that, well, I'm in charge, no doctor, right? No other person. I'm making these decisions, and I get to suffer the consequences of those decisions. But that's a very, very hard transition. So anything we can do to make that, children with disabilities feel more in charge of their bodies and their lives would be helpful. It would make that really hard transition a little easier. And then people who acquire their disabilities later in life have a very different perspective. And Michelle and I know that because we've been playing in the disability community for a very long period of time. And people will say with spinal cord injuries that they've acquired from an accident or work have a very different life perspective than we do. And they have access to things we don't. So often if you acquire a disability later in life, you have some sort of insurance that you can rely on. Kids with disabilities don't necessarily can have access to insurance. People who acquire their disabilities later in life have a before and after. And so they often can be extremely motivated and assertive in returning to the way things once were. Whether it's possible or not, that's a whole other thing, but they can be very assertive about getting their needs met because they want to get back to something they had before. And these are just some generalizations I'm giving you to try and give you show you the difference. And then seniors have a very different attitude. And even though 76% of seniors have a disability, they do not like to be identified that way. So I think it's just really important in doing work that we know that, right? That we know that a senior is not going to be like, is not going to like being told they have a disability. And in fact, my entire family, like my immediate family, I was born with my disability and it was a real challenge, right? But my mom has rheumatoid arthritis, my dad is blind, and my sister has MS. And none of them would probably identify as having a disability because they compare themselves to me. And that's not right. I mean, they face challenges as well. So it's just an important thing to look at when doing work in the community.
Okay, so now we're just going to go over some general tips for all disabilities. The first one is relax and be yourself. We're all just human. So yeah, just take the time to listen. And like we talked about before, and ask, how can I help? Or do you need help? And then how can I help?
And then treat each person as an individual. Ask them what would make them most comfortable and be respectful and considerate. So, and I just want to say that, we know we have a disability, because people get really nervous around us, but we know you're not comfortable at first, and we're usually got the skills to help you get there. So trust in that, but also, sorry, I'm just going off topic here, Michelle, but the other thing always to realize is we're just like everyone else in society. Some of us have really bad attitudes. And so you're going to run across people with disabilities who don't want any of these tips and don't want to be treated in certain ways. And that's just the reality, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay. And like we talked about before, is don't assume that you know what someone needs. And also, I just want to point out, just because let's say a family member or a friend has this type of disability, that how to help another person with that same disability. You don't, we're all different. So just like I said before, ask questions, ask how you can help. And like Roxanne said, we have the skills to get you through it, and we help each other out. So, yeah.
The next one is walk normally when helping somebody with a disability. So, I think of somebody who is blind, right, in this situation. You just walk normally, you let them know if there are any barriers. And again, like, I just want to say, like, I had a friend who was blind. We worked together, and he had a guide dog. Well, his guide dog would pick me off, right? We'd be walking straight down the hallway and he would just slowly eliminate me from the conversation. It was hilarious. So, I mean, just want to say that even though you're trying to walk normally, the dog, in that situation,
might
the
not
dog was making the decisions.
And also, really important, don't touch or move any equipment that is used by a person with a disability without consent. So you always want to ask if you could move their equipment somewhere, because when we're using our equipment, that's our body. That's a part of our body. Restaurants and hospitals tend to do this the most, especially hospitals. They want to take your wheelchair or your cane or whatever and shove it in the closet. Well, no, that is my legs. Like, don't shove it in the closet. And restaurants, like, I use a scooter. So restaurants like to move my scooter out of the way, out of sight. And I'm like, no, I need to see that. Not only is it my legs, but it's also very expensive. So don't be moving it and touching it without my knowledge and moving it out of my sight. So
yeah, that's kind of the rule. As long as we can see it, okay, put it over there. I just need to be able to see it.
Yeah.
Oh, and I had a little, oh, well, okay. I had a little example, but I went out of my mind. Okay, so the next one is be confident, calm, and reassuring. Even if the person exhibits unusual behavior, focus on how you can help. And so I have a friend with Down syndrome. And when he gets in certain situations, he will just start babbling in a language he's made up on his own, right? And I don't know what to do. but the thing is I don't have to do anything. For me, because I am a friend of his, but I call him on it. I'm like, why are we speaking a different language right now? What happened? And I kind of just make light of it and joke about it a bit and try and make sure there's not something going on that maybe I could mediate for him. But I've just decided it's kind of just a nervous thing he does, and there's not really any rhyme or reason. So you just go with it, and eventually he starts talking normally, and we move on. So.
And the last one, be patient, optimistic, and the willingness to find a way to communicate are your best tools. So yeah, like, was there anybody else? If you're patient and willing to listen and help, there, like Roxanne does with her friend, there's usually a way, you find your way. Like,
well, and for an example, we did a kind of an assessment and a presentation for Garneau Theatre, and you guys might know Garneau Theatre. Well, there's pretty much nothing they can do to make that properly accessible.
Oh, no.
But they want all community, right? They want us to be there, right? And so that's why they engaged with us. And basically I just said, look, you guys are going to have to apologize and offer to go to the concession for people, and you're just going to have to do extra, right? Because there's no way to make this accessible, but your attitude can have all the difference between, as to whether somebody has a good time or not. So
yeah,
attitude is really important.
And a lot of ways that's what makes the difference, is the attitude, the willingness to help, the willingness to accommodate in whatever way you can. That quite often makes the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Invisible disabilities. We really like to spend just a tiny bit of time exclusively on people with invisible disabilities, because so for those of us that have visible disabilities, we're often seen to be less able than we actually are. But people with invisible disabilities are often seen to be more able than they actually are. And so what it comes down to with invisible disabilities is disclosure. When do I tell somebody? Like, especially when you're looking for work, right? Do I tell them in the interview? Do I wait till they offer me the job? Do I tell them before I sign the employment letter? Maybe not. Maybe I'll wait for 3 months and make sure it's a fit for both of us. Like, it's a really, really, really hard decision to make about when to disclose. And so the reason we like to talk about it is we think everyone should have empathy towards this. We think employers should not make judgments, right? Because this is a hard decision for somebody to make. And really, in the end, when it comes to especially employment, it's just about whether the person can do the job or not, right? It has nothing to do with the disability, or shouldn't, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so what is ableism? Ableism is the belief that people with disabilities have less worth than people without disabilities. For instance, some people may hold the false belief that people with disabilities matter less than non-disabled people because they think, right?
People with disabilities cannot contribute to society, which is
Hello.
not true.
The second one, because they think people with disabilities need help from non-disabled people who are more important, which is so not true. We all need help from other people, whether they're disabled or not. We all need help. Roxanne and I help each other all the time, and as a human race, we all need help from each other, period.
Yeah, I had to learn later in life, because you strive to be independent, and really we're all interdependent.
Oh, yeah.
And that's something that's the way we should be looking at things, because yeah. And then the third one is certain movement, senses, or thought processes are needed for everyday activities, such as working and marriage. And again, that's not true. We have an amazing, we're a very adapted species. If we want something, we find a way.
Yeah, we do. Excuse me. And the last one, cannot care for homes and families. Well, that's certainly not true. I've taken care of my home and my family for over 20 years now. And when I lived at home, I took care of my parents' home too, helped out. So obviously that's not true.
Okay. And so recognizing and averting ableism. So we just, again, have some quick tips for you on how how these things can happen. So the first one is you can't versus how can. I had a girlfriend go decide, she's very much like me, uses a wheelchair independently. She decided when she was quite young, right, in her early 20s, she wanted to work at the Sears clothing department. And in my mind, I thought, okay. But she got herself an interview, and an older manager came to interview her, and she could see on this manager's face from, the first second that this wasn't going to go well. But this manager said to her, well, you can't do this. Like, you can't reach those clothes up there. And my friend would say, well, sure I can. Where's that stick that everybody else uses? I can use that stick. Well, you can't reach the cash register. Well, yeah, I just need a stool, right? I can transfer off and on and off a stool. No big deal, right? So for everything that this manager said to her, you can't, my friend would come back and explain how she could. And it would have been a completely different interview had the managers just said, how can you do this? Because it's okay for an employer maybe not to understand and want to know, right? But telling her she can't and having to prove it was not cool. It would have been a completely different interview had she just asked how. I mean, she still probably wouldn't have got the job, but good for her for trying.
Okay, and the second one, believe people when they disclose a disability. And now Roxanne just talked about in the previous slide how hard it was for somebody to disclose. So when someone tells you they have a disability, just believe them. Just take it as face value and help them accommodate their needs.
And we would ask, why wouldn't you? But we've seen situations where people
Yeah.
aren't believed, and it's just sad.
Yeah.
So the next one is don't assume you know what somebody needs. And we've kind of already talked about this, that, even though that person might have a very similar disability, they might have a very different way of achieving their needs and goals. So it's always good to ask.
And one was missed. Listen to people when they request an accommodation. So when someone asks for accommodation, you do what you can to accommodate them. And it could be as simple as sitting them at the edge of the table instead of in the middle of the room kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a complicated accommodation. So when they need or when someone requests accommodation, do what you can to accommodate them. Okay.
And again, there's always going to be people that might not ask for what, there's always going to be people that play, but that's such a small part of the population that we don't think that any focus should go there.
No.
Just believe people.
And don't speak on behalf of someone with a disability unless you're explicitly asked to. And I've had this happen numerous of times. One time I was shopping with my sister and her husband, and I found something I wanted to buy. So my brother-in-law brought me up to the till to pay for my shirt. And the clerk is telling my brother-in-law how to wash the shirt. And I looked at him and I said, I'm the one buying the shirt. I'm the one that's going to wear and wash the shirt. I don't even live with him. And he's like, oh, and then he started talking to me. But automatically, he talked to my brother-in-law instead of me. So I still get that once in a while, but not too much anymore. I'm a little bit more sort of,
We learn as we get older, all the
yeah,
tricks, right? And so the next one is talk about disability with everybody. So we
yeah.
think that there's a lot of shame associated with disability when, quite frankly, Michelle and I feel very differently. We're proud of who we are and how hard we've worked to be where we're at. And it makes us very sad that disability is still associated quite high with shame. And so one of the examples we like to talk about is shushing children. Like,
Mm-hmm.
never shush your children because they've noticed that somebody, that we're mobilizing differently in the world, right? Don't shush them. If we look friendly, let them ask, because I would quite happily tell a small child that my legs don't work. That's why I use wheels. Like, it's not a big deal. And that's what we would like people to do, is just normalize. So even if you don't want your child to go talk to a stranger, just say, oh, well, that's just how they get around. No big deal. Right? We don't have to make it into something that is shameful and that we should be avoided or made invisible. So, yeah.
And the last comment is quite important. But one of the most important things that to do to push back against ableism is make sure people with disabilities are at the table where decisions are being made. And there's a saying we all say in the disability community: nothing about us without us. Like,
So, sorry,
go ahead.
just to give you an example, this year I was working with the Affordable Housing Lab at the University of Alberta, and I ended up in a room full of architects with just me. And I had to listen to them talk about how they were going to help those poor people and brag about all the home renovations they were doing when I literally can't find anywhere to live other than, like, Michelle and I live in one of the only buildings in the city with accessible housing. So we joke about the fact that the only way we leave here is in a coffin, because there's literally nowhere else to live. And so it is extremely offensive to be sitting in a room full of elite professionals talking about how to help us and saying things like, well, we couldn't find anybody to talk to. Like, I'm sure my head was exploding. So I'm like, well, I can introduce you.
Come to my building.
But that's just an example where we shouldn't be talked about if we're not in the room, right? And that still happens a lot more than
A lot, yeah.
So we just land here to make sure that that there are many different barriers that affect us in our lives: institutional, attitudinal, transportation, communication, environmental, just to name a few. So it's a very, like we said in the beginning, it's a very complicated phenomenon that's not easy to sort through, but Canada has to try. We tend to facade over everything. Well, look, we've got curb cuts. We don't have anywhere to live, but we can get around on the streets. Like, we need to really work harder at this. And there you get to see actually what we look like instead of just Zoom.
Yeah.
And I'll go first.
Yeah,
right?
you go. Yeah.
So we just like to end our presentations again because we feel there's too much shame around disability. And Michelle and I are very proud of the lives we've lived. I'm a former Paralympian. I competed in the 1988 Paralympics in Seoul, South Korea, which seems like so long ago. And it was amazing. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity had I lived elsewhere in the world. Like, Canada was amazing at that time in my life. But I just want to say Edmonton was the place in the world to play wheelchair basketball in 1988. I haven't heard anything about wheelchair basketball in Edmonton. Nothing. Like, where'd it go? What happened? Where did all those sports go? And, so we've lost a lot since then. And so that makes me very sad, but I'm always appreciative for the opportunity that Canada gave me to represent. And I've went to college and university. I have 2 cats named Peace and Love. I've had relationships that no longer do and quite happy with that. So yeah, we live great lives. And Michelle.
Yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Yeah, like Roxanne, I live a fabulous life. I mean, I've been married just over 20 years, have two wonderful stepdaughters, and I've gone to university not once but twice. And like you heard in the presentation, I've been horseback riding a lot of years since I was 11 years old. And you know what? I couldn't even picture a different life than what I have now. Yeah. And part of the reason why my life is so fabulous is, can you flip? Is because of my parents. In this case, I'm going to share a story about my mom. And she's probably one of the biggest reasons why I'm such a success today. So I was born with cerebral palsy. I probably should have gone to a speech therapist, but I didn't. My mom noticed when I was very young that I was starting I'm sorry, but my mom noticed I wasn't starting to talk at the right age. My sister kind of talked for me. I would point and grunt, and and my sister talked for me. So I don't know if it was just me being lazy or me having cerebral palsy or both. But she thought it was because of my older sister was doing the talking for me. Then my mom noticed that I was having a hard time forming words. So my mom took it upon herself to teach me how to speak herself. She told me she would sit me down in front of her and she would form the words really slow with her mouth, and I would watch her so intently and mimic her, and eventually the words came. But on the other hand, so I never did go to speech therapy whatsoever. But this is why we need people like you, because not everyone has parents that notice these things. So we need good people. And that could have made a difference in my life, totally different. Because if I didn't learn how to speak with my mom teach me, I might have not learned how to speak properly. And I would not be doing this job. I would not be a public speaker. So that one little thing she noticed made a big change. And that's where you guys come in too, right? You could change someone's life because we, having a disability, have so many barriers already. And speech can be one of the biggest barriers.
So we think your jobs are really important,
Yeah.
and we appreciate the work you do.
Okay.
Awesome.
So Rock, can you just turn over the host to me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So if you guys have any questions, I noticed the chat was very quiet. That's kind of nice, actually. Usually I'm trying to look at the chat and speak at the same time. So
do you
if
guys have any questions?
Yeah. Thank you.
I had a quick, oh, sorry, am I interrupting someone? I can't tell. I had a quick question. Thank you, both of you. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Your slide about I can't remember what it was titled, but like the words and phrases section.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because I think a lot of time people don't use it with negative intent, but it's just in the vocabulary. And yeah. I know that speaks to my privilege because I never like things like, you know, handicapped parking spots or washrooms or special needs teachers or that kind of thing. Like there's just so many terms like that are used so commonly in society. And I don't know if you guys have the answer to this. This might be a broad question, but obviously I'd like to change my vocab to more inclusive words. So did you have a suggestion for things like a special needs teacher or a handicapped washroom, those kind of things? Like, do you have any recommendations?
For one, it's accessible washroom and accessible parking. Go ahead, Roxanne.
No, you're doing good.
Oh, and for teachers, uh, teachers that teach children with disabilities. It
So
might be a
simple.
little longer, but it's a little bit more dignified. Do you have something better than that, Roxanne?
No, but it's interesting in context because so Michelle
Yeah.
and I are about 5 years apart in age. I never heard special needs ever growing up, went to a regular school, had none of that. And then in the early 70s, they just decided they were going to integrate, and that's when everything went sideways. And so I actually remember when that term special needs sort of started to come into use in the 90s. And I was screaming back then, I'm like, what is happening?
Yeah.
That is not a good word. It doesn't make me feel good. And again, this goes to show that we need to engage people with disabilities in these conversations, because Michelle and I have surveyed everyone in our community. So we don't make these comments just because we think them. Right. That's important to know, is that we have an entire community that we know and that we talk to and we get feedback from. So when we develop something for this workshop, we put it through a whole bunch of people to make sure it's not just Michelle and I. And special needs, hands down, there's not one person with a disability that we have found that like that word.
No, not at all.
So,
And even on like, I'm an animal show lover, right? The rescues, the vet shows, all this. And they even call special needs animals special needs. And I'm going, oh my God. Like,
it sounds patronizing to us.
Yeah.
We don't want to be special. I worked I can't even tell you how hard I worked just to be included.
Yeah.
And even though I was doing twice as much and probably better and smarter, I got to be average. And I was thrilled. But then to say I'm special after I've worked so hard to not be, like,
Yeah. I feel the exact same way in school. I have to work twice as hard as everybody else just to keep up. Not to get ahead, but just to keep up, just to keep average marks going. I had to work twice as hard. So
we just want the same opportunities. I mean, that's what we're working for, is to get the same opportunities as our siblings, because that's often who we compare ourselves to. People, I had a young man with a disability like 20 years ago say to me, well, I don't want to be a part of the disability community, and he has a disability, right? And I'm like, okay, dude, like, first of all, we don't live somewhere all together. Like, there's this assumption that we all grow up in regular families. Like, I grew up in northeastern Alberta on a farm. I didn't even meet another person with a disability until I was much older. And then I played wheelchair basketball. Well, those aren't really people with disabilities. I mean, technically they are, but they are the ablest of able, right? And so those aren't necessarily my people. It was when I started meeting other people who grew up with their disabilities that I really went, oh, we all kind of think the same. Interesting. So anyways, that's probably a lot more than you needed.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? I know we're at our time, but
we are, but
I had a question for you, Roxanne, because I personally was wondering at the beginning of this presentation if you were someone with disabilities or whether you were just someone that worked really closely with people with disabilities. And so I was wondering if you perceived, because you talked about the invisible disabilities versus the more visible ones, and whether over the course of this whole COVID thing, whether your experience has changed a little bit when you interact with people mostly online versus in person, I guess.
I mean, Michelle and I have been much more successful during this COVID time because it's easier for people to just log on to Zoom. And so we feel we've had a lot more opportunities. So yeah, but again, we're very afraid it's just going to go back to the way it was. Right. And that we won't be included, and it will be really, really difficult. Not that we can't do it. Michelle and I show up. But we were saying to Matt, I think before everybody got here, we got stuck because Dats didn't pick her up one night. It was 35 below, 9 o'clock at night. Call for a taxi, had to wait an hour and a half. It was terrifying.
At the Cats building at the U of A. the pharmacy building.
Uh-huh.
Bad location to find me.
Yeah, they said they couldn't find her, and so
Yeah.
they just left her there and would not come back.
Yeah. First
Um,
time in 30 years of taking naps that they would not come back. And it had to be on the coldest, one of the coldest nights of the winter. And it was a night.
But, it's interesting you mentioned, that you had kind of a different impression of me, but that is a challenge for all of us in how we make our assumptions, right? Because, and believe me, I understand, because I have people with invisible disabilities that we work with, that sometimes I'm like, I don't know quite what the disability is here, but really it's none of my business. It doesn't change what I do, right? And in the same, that's how I would look at it from your perspective. Is it going to change anything in my life, whether I believe them or not? Then believe them,
Yeah, that kind of struck me also when you two were speaking about like viewing using the medical terms versus I guess like the functional terms, and how we have this kind of curiosity always for that medical term when how does that impact you, and why is that impacting your perception of that person? Like, why is that the deciding factor in how you're perceiving them?
Yeah.
Well, and interesting because, Michelle now has said that she has cerebral palsy. Well, that can, like, the range, like, of ability within that label is just astronomical. So it's of no use other than to put some sort of weird impression on somebody, right? Because, again, people that grow up with their disabilities tend to get treated in a certain way. So if I give you that label, well, then, oh, you're one of them. Where if I just tell you I use a wheelchair, you don't get to make that association, right? And not that you would, right? Not saying that you would make a negative association, right? But a lot of people do.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for answering that and having that little discussion.
Yeah, no, you're welcome.
I got a quick question for the both of you. How did you guys end up into the field of advocacy work?
How did we end up? Well, Roxanne has been in it a lot longer than I have. I actually started in my early 20s working for the Cerebral Palsy Association, but never considered myself an advocate or anything like that. I just did presentations about cerebral palsy. And then I went back to school and I came back and I got on the board of Voices. And then this job came about and I got this job. And at this time I had known Roxanne for about 10 years, I guess.
Often, yeah, we kept running into each other.
Yeah. And then she got me to live in the building where she lives. So we became closer. And when I got this job, I roped her into it. And because of this job and knowing her, I just got more exposed, I guess, to different things in the disability community and different arguments and different fights to fight and all that kind of stuff. And I've been in it ever since. So yeah, I guess it was a natural progression with me almost. I was going that way anyway, Rox?
Well, I mean, I guess people would consider me an activist, I guess, because even in the paper, I've been called an activist. I don't feel like an activist because I don't confront people, I don't march, I don't do anything like that. But I do have, I spent a long time working on my words to make them strong and assertive and rights-based. And this is just a passion. I had a lot of trouble working. I was exhausted. I couldn't advance in my career because I was too tired at the end of the day to do anything other than what I was doing. And then because of that, it led to depression and anxiety. And finally, I was working for the federal government and they offered me a medical retirement in 2005, but I'd already not been working for a few years before that, off and on. Clinical depression in my 20s. I lost like 6 years of my life. And so that, like I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, when they offered me a medical retirement, driving home that day, tears streaming down my face, I'm 35 years old, my life is over. What do I do now? And I remember I was driving from the airport because I worked at customs. So I was driving home on Highway 2, and it was like, I'm so angry that it was like, this pension is going to pay my way to advocate, and I won't need anybody's money to do it. Right? Because what happens in the disability community is they rope you in for working for a nonprofit, and then you can't speak your truth. You have to speak party line. It's a huge mess of politics.
It is.
So the reason I've been able to stay a strong advocate for 20 years is I won't work for anybody, and I don't have to. Right? I get a comfortable pension. It's not great. I still get a bit of a housing subsidy, but it's enough to live a good life. And this feeds my soul. This feeds my soul because I know that I'm not going to make life better for me. It's the next generation. It's these little girls that I met, that were mini me's, that I'm like, oh, I'm going to make it better for you guys. And so that's my goal. Is I just want to make life better for people. And we have so much potential, that is not being used and not being appreciated. And I will tell you that people with disabilities are some of the smartest, funniest people I have ever met in my life. I actually kind of think back and go, I'm thrilled that most of my people have disabilities because they're funny. They're entertaining. Like, we have to find the funny to get through all of this.
Yeah.
And so it's just been a very rewarding part of my life. And now it is my mission. It is pretty much all I do. So so thank you guys for being here and hearing us and asking such great questions.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for being willing to present to all of us. And
Not a problem.
They're not here today yet. They've also recorded, like I said. So if you guys want to go back and rewatch this, or
and I'll probably get that link to you by tomorrow.
Did you stop recording, Michelle?
No, I should.
Yeah, you probably can stop now.
Yeah, I wanted to get all the questions.